So Labour has voted against a new policing bill after voicing anger in the Commons following the police's actions at Saturday's vigil for Sarah Everard.
Well, Shadow Justice Secretary David Lammy joins us now. Morning, Mr. Lammy. You gave a very powerful speech about what effect the new measures on policing protest may have had if we looked back through history, the sorts of things that might not have changed as a result of this sort of protest. The numbers in the Commons mean that this bill has been passed, but just give viewers who may not have seen that yesterday an idea of what you think this would have stopped.
Well, the point is it's not at all clear why we need this legislation, why the government needs to crack down on a fundamental right in a democratic country, and that's the right to take to the streets and demonstrate why you're upset with something. And if you think back, did we need this power when women were fighting for the vote, when they were chaining themselves to Parliament and throwing themselves under carriages? No, we didn't. Did we need this power when so many of us were walking through the streets, black and white, protesting apartheid in South Africa? No, we didn't. And I've lived through some really tough protests, things like the poll tax riots. Margaret Thatcher didn't introduce this legislation in Parliament. So why do we need it now?
Well, that's it. And it's so interesting you say all of that. I mean, I'll put one protest to you, the Extinction Rebellion protest, where protesters glued themselves to trains. Now, that caused a lot of upset, not least amongst the transport workers, who were then in an absolutely hideous position. Or protests where you have seen, access to hospitals blocked, to ambulances trying to get critically ill people into hospital. In those cases, David Lammy, you probably would be on the wrong side of the argument, because people would say those protests have to be better regulated.
The point is, Susanna, we have the powers now to act. And anyone who saw those images on Saturday night of the police manhandling women, mourning the death of Sarah Everard, will rightly conclude, hang on a minute, the police has those powers. Why do we need to legislate to give them more? And more importantly, is this the priority? When 55,000 women every year are reporting rape and only 1,700 of them are finding charges brought, surely we should be dealing with women and girls and the violence against them.
No, I don't think, David. No one could argue with that, David. I think one of the position that the police found themselves in on Saturday night, of course, is they are trying to enact rules that are put into place by the government because we're in the middle of a pandemic, and they are trying to protect the general public from a virus that is killing people in their hundreds of thousands.
I understand that, but the point is, last night, Parliament passed at second reading a bill that doesn't address the serious issues facing women. And I recognise, of course, that we have a pandemic, but you will also recognise that there was much debate and discussion about having a peaceful vigil that was socially distanced. And I've got to tell you, when that took place in other cities across the country without those scenes, there must quite rightly be serious questions to answer.
I wonder whether you think that more legislation giving more power to the police to prevent protests actually puts the police in a harder position. Because, as Ben says, at the weekend, the police came under heavy criticism on Clapham Common for what they say was just doing their job. Their job under coronavirus regulations was to protect public health and to disperse mass gatherings where people were no longer socially distancing. If you give them even more powers to crack down on protests, does that make their jobs easier or harder?
Well, it's about what kind of country you want to live in. Is this a country where statues are more important than women? Well, generally when we're speaking about those countries, we're in China and Mao, Stalin and Russia. We're not in the United Kingdom, frankly. The police have the powers There are loads of powers on the statute book. This is a distraction from the main issues facing our country at this time. Of course, getting out of the pandemic, but dealing with the problem of women and violence. That was the opportunity that the government should have taken.
OK,
and
so let me put the alternative view for that, which is that your party's plan all along until the weekend was to abstain on this particular legislation. And we spoke to Jess Phillips, one of your colleagues yesterday, who admitted that MPs hadn't spoken up when the exemption for protest was taken out of the legislation. You could be accused of political opportunism here. You know, this legislation has been prepared for a long time. There were other moments when you could have spoken up.
Susanna, it's quite the opposite. This is a massive omnibus bill of 300 pages that the government dumped on Parliament last week, at this time last week. And of course, it took a long time to digest what was in it. We knew, because the government had published a white paper, that there was a sentencing bill, but these provisions around protests were new. Provisions around trespass were new. And we had to digest that. And also, as an opposition, you speak to people. You speak to women. You speak to groups that protest regularly. You speak to unions, you speak to many to reach your position. And that was why we reached the position that whilst there were things in this bill that were good, and there are things, many things that the Labour Party have campaigned for, dangerous driving, breach of trust by coaches and priests who sexually abuse young people, all those things we've campaigned for. I'm afraid it was so egregious in relation to women and in relation to protests, we had to vote against it.
So if we hadn't seen the scenes that we saw on Saturday night, if the police had let that vigil finish peacefully, as the people that were there were hoping, although it did seem to turn into a protest towards the end, if we hadn't seen those scenes, would you have voted against the bill or would you have abstained?
I'm very confident that we would have reached the position we reached, because it's very clear. It was an illustration, frankly, that we do not need these powers. It's not central to the debate. If women are walking in fear, we should be legislating to protect them against stranger abduction and making that whole life. It's not currently in this country. We should be legislating to protect them from being harassed in the street. It's not currently in this bill. Stalking, not in this bill. Misogyny and hate, not in this bill. For all of those reasons, of course, being a responsible opposition, we had to vote against this bill.